Welcome, everyone. My name is Emily Chandler. I am the chair of the City of Stratford's Energy and Environment Committee. And I'm going to turn it over right away to Bill James Ebel, who is here representing Climate Momentum, and he will be sharing a land acknowledgement with us tonight. So, Bill.
Thank you. We'd like to begin by acknowledging that the land we stand upon is the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee, Anishinaabe, Neutral, and Wendat peoples. Oral and archaeological records indicate that the Haudenosaunee, or people of the Longhouse, have been occupants of southwestern Ontario for over 13,000 years. This territory was subject to the Dish with One Spoon Covenant Wampum, signed between Indigenous nations in 1701, and was also subject to the Upper Canada Treaties in the later 18th and 19th centuries. We respect the long-standing relationships that Indigenous nations have to this land. This territory continues to be home to diverse Indigenous peoples, whom we recognize as its original caretakers and its contemporary stewards. The dish, or as it's sometimes called, the bowl of the Dish with the One Spoon Wampum, represented what is now Southern Ontario, from the Great Lakes to Quebec, from Lake Simcoe to the United States. This treaty acknowledged the shared responsibility of ensuring the dish would never empty, which included taking care of the land and the animals who inhabited it. Importantly, spoons were brought to the treaty table, not weapons, as a representation of keeping the peace. The wampum referenced is an intricately decorated belt which symbolized the agreement, in effect, a record of the diplomatic agreement to ensure that memory of the agreement would be preserved. The wampum is mostly made of white whelk shells with an area of purple cowhog clam shells in the center, representing the dish. It currently resides at the Royal Ontario Museum. One of the core values of the Dish with One Spoon is that those who use the land should not abuse the land. In other words, individuals and groups should only take what they need from the land so that there will be a healthy, long-term, sustainable environment. We look to the wisdom of the Indigenous peoples to assist us in the care and management of our earth, water, and air for future generations. We wish to express, too, support for the implementation of the 94 calls to action in the recommendations of the 2015 Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And we welcome the introduction of the Bill C-15 legislation in Canada to implement the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And this week of all weeks, we who are descendants from settlers acknowledge that we have made promises both past and present, promises which we have not kept, and history we have not faced. These are important steps towards healing and justice, and environmental and social justice are closely intertwined. Thanks, Emily.
Thank you very much, Bill. I really appreciate you sharing that because, as you said, environmental and social justice are intertwined, and we felt it really important that that be shared before tonight's webinar. So with that being said, I want to officially welcome you to tonight's Invasive Species webinar. This is an event in cooperation with the Energy and Environment Committee, Climate Momentum, as well as Stratford Field Naturalists. And we are on Zoom on a webinar as well as on Facebook Live. If you require this recording or information in any other version of the material, you can contact the City Clerk's office. And this meeting will be recorded and then uploaded onto the City of Stratford's website. That address is stratford.ca/climate. Through the webinar, you are invited to ask questions. If you look towards the bottom right of your screen, you'll see the Q&A box. You can submit those. I'll be keeping an eye on those, as well as Anna, who is monitoring the Facebook comments. And the overview of the agenda. So I'm going to turn it momentarily to Terry Crabe, who is the new president of the Stratford Field Naturalists. He's going to share a little bit about that organization, and then we're going to get right into the presentation from Jay Ebel. So Terry, I will pass it to you right now.
Thank you, Emily. The Stratford Field Naturalists were established in 1966 to share a common interest in Stratford and the surrounding natural environment, and to support its conservation. We currently have over 100 members, and surprisingly have had new members joining during the recent pandemic. Our meetings under normal circumstances are held the second Tuesday of each month from September to June, where we learn about the natural world through a variety of guest speakers. The club also sponsors a series of outings or walks throughout the year to familiarize members and the public with the features of the area, as well as the associated flora and fauna found in those areas. Members have participated in a variety of monitoring programs, such as the yearly Christmas bird count, the Great Canadian Birdathon each May, a chimney swift monitoring program, and the current breeding bird atlas for Ontario. The club has even conducted a yearly roadside cleanup between Stratford and Sebringville in non-COVID times. So I imagine we'll get back at it next year. One area that is near and dear to the hearts of many of our members is the Dolan. Members of the group walk through the Dolan every Sunday morning at 9 a.m. year-round. We experience the changing seasons, temperatures, snow, migrating birds, as well as the changing uses of this area. We're well aware not only of the presence of invasive species, but also the effects that they are having on the natural ecosystems. We're also very aware of the invasive effects of adjacent landowners that they have on the system as they clear areas in the Dolan adjacent to their properties, establish new entrance paths, and also deposit a lot of yard waste directly into the Dolan. Individually, these effects do not seem all that great, but when you add the effect of over 100 adjacent landowners to the mix, the effect is significant. We all want the Dolan to be sustainable, and we are looking forward to helping in whatever manner we can to achieve that. Thank you for including us in this presentation.
Amazing. Thank you, Terry. It's nice to have you here and to learn more about what Stratford Field Naturalists do. So without further ado, Jay, I'm going to turn it over to you. Jay Ebel is a colleague of mine from the Upper Thames River Conservation Authority, and he is UTRCA's Forestry and Habitat Restoration Technician. He will be launching into his presentation, and then, as I said, handling or answering the questions that we pose throughout the presentation. So over to you, Jay.
Okay, thanks, Emily. Hopefully everybody can hear me, and if not, send a message to Emily and I will double check my settings. As Emily said, I'm with the Upper Thames Conservation Authority and I'm a forestry technician. Over the years, we've always been aware of some invasive species, and as time has gone on, more and more invasive species are coming to the forefront and definitely requiring our attention. So when Emily approached me about this, we talked about it and tried to narrow it down to 4 species. So it's only narrowed down to 4, but please don't think that's all that there is out there. But we're dealing with I'm going to talk about the 4 that we deal with the most in St. Mary's, Stratford, Mitchell, and Perth County in general. I figured I'd keep it kind of general to that area. So I'm going to jump into my PowerPoint, and I do apologize. I have some slides that are a little wordy, and as I go through them, when I get to slides with pictures in them, I'll have a little more of a story to share with you about what it is that we've done, some of the projects we've done, successes, failures, and so on. So, as I said, invasive species is the topic, as we all know. The two pictures on our primary slide here are European buckthorn on the left, and then Japanese knotweed on the right. So let's
Sorry,
start with
Jay.
Japanese. Yep.
Sorry to interrupt. I don't see your slides.
Oh, because we haven't shared screen.
Yeah.
That's right. Thanks for the, there's always one hiccup.
As much as it's nice to look at you.
There we go. There's always a little hiccup right at the beginning. There we go. Have we got it now?
Yes, yeah.
Perfect. Okay. Yep. I knew I was going to make a mistake somewhere. Invasive species. The one on the left is buckthorn, and the one on the right is Japanese knotweed. So we'll start with Japanese knotweed. It's a plant that is native to Eastern Asia. In North America, unfortunately, it was brought over like many invasives are, and it's established in a lot of different places. It's classified as a pest in several countries on both continents. It's a lot of people associate it with bamboo. It has a hollow stem. It's not related. It's not in the same plant family. But most people, when you say Japanese knotweed, they don't know what you're talking about. But if you ever ask them if they've ever seen what looks like bamboo growing naturally, a lot of people will say, "Oh, yes, I've seen that." Or unfortunately, sometimes they also say, "Yes, I have that in my yard and in my garden. It's very beautiful." And I don't doubt that it is, but unfortunately, it is very invasive. It can get to 8 to 10 feet in height, very large patches when exposed to full sunlight, and it is super thick. It can become so thick that you can't even walk through it. It's listed by the World Conservation Union as one of the world's worst invasive species. It's a frequent colonizer of riparian areas, roadsides, ditches, and it always crowds out the native species that we find growing in an area. It's really hard for our native species to compete with. The problem with being in the riparian areas is that it actually can, the way the root system works, it actually can help, no, not help, that's not the word I want to use. It can lead to, and it can increase the chances of erosion. So it can cause bank erosion when these mats become so thick, and then as the water catches it, can rip the whole area out and then causes a lot of erosion. So its rhizomes, its roots can extend 7 meters horizontally and 3 meters deep, which makes removal by excavation very, very difficult. And cutting it, unfortunately, just causes it to grow more. So control methods for Japanese knotweed. Control methods to eradicate the plant. It's really spread by the roots, so those need to be killed. All above ground portions of the plant need to be controlled repeatedly for several years. And at this point, I'm talking about using herbicides, and that's in order to weaken and kill the entire patch. The abundance of the plant can be significantly reduced by applying herbicides. So some of the herbicides that the authority uses is glyphosate, imazapyr, and triclopyr. And those can be sprayed a foliar spray, so that's just spraying on the leaf, or cutting visible stalks, filling the stems with glyphosate, or they can be injected with a needle as well. So I do appreciate that pesticides in general and herbicides specifically are a cause for concern for many people. And I don't want people to think that my promotion of them in this on this topic is necessarily that I think they should be used, widespread. But for a lot of invasive species, it is very, very, very difficult to control them without chemicals. I'm not saying impossible, but it is very, very difficult. So with Japanese knotweed, a more ecologically friendly means is being tested. And this is a big one that I'm interested in, that we're interested in at the authority, is soil steam sterilization, which involves injecting steam into contaminated soil in order to kill subterranean plant parts. I've seen a short video of it, and I had tried to link it here so that you might be able to see it as well. But Unfortunately, that didn't work. And the big question that obviously we always have when it comes to things like this is how much. Definitely, when it comes to dealing with invasive species, we all have to find a balance, whether it's we are doing it on authority land, whether we're doing it on city property, whether we're doing it on property managed by the province or the country, or even on private land for a lot of landowners. Cost is always the concern. I'm not saying that everybody wants to go cheapest, but it is definitely a concern. So we're anxious to see what the soil steam sterilization looks like. There is also the introduction of insects from Eastern Asia that feed on Japanese knotweed as an alternative. Mechanical control is very difficult due to their large systems, root systems. As I mentioned before, the root systems can be 7 meters by 3 meters. And to remove that much soil is an excavation that nobody wants to see on their property. It's not something anybody wants to see in a natural area, and especially, we're talking about TJ Dolan. The number of yards of soil that would mean, it would cause erosion concerns. It would be an open bed for other invasives. So mechanical control is very difficult due to that. So here's where I will share a little more of a story at the moment. So in TJ Dolan, this is a picture of one of the patches of Japanese knotweed we've been working on. I was approached by Craig Merkley of the UTRCA, and he said that the city, specifically in the Environmental Energy Committee, had raised some concerns about this through its members, and he had asked, what we could do. So I went out with Craig and we took a look, and he showed me what the patch was, and all things considered, it wasn't a horribly large patch, but I said that we could handle it. Now, that being said, this is, there's a better look. That's just a portion of the patch. The patch was approximately 25 meters by about 4 meters. So about 100 square meters or so. And it's over by the water treatment facility. Now, there are a couple of small patches sort of scattered through TJ Dolan where there's really just a handful of plants that have come up, and we're working on those as well. So this is all this is sort of pre-spray, pre-treatment for the very first time, and that is after the first treatment. So same sign over by the water treatment facility. And like I said, it's so thick you can't really walk through it. And that's after first treatment. Now, sorry, and again, there's first treatment as well. So the funny thing is, this picture is year 2. And what we find is that Japanese knotweed always comes back. There's no way around it. It's always going to come back. But every year, as the years progress, we see a thinning, we see a reduction in stem numbers and density, and we see sort of a return of some of the more native species. And then that's the area just recently. So it went from being a complete thicket of nothing but Japanese knotweed, and here now you can actually just pick out the individual stems that have leafed out. So really the density has been at this point reduced almost to 25% of what the original stand was. So one of the areas where we've really dealt with a lot of Japanese knotweed recently is over in Mitchell. And that is all Japanese knotweed. And what happened was the Jeff Brick, I don't know if any of you know, some of you may know Jeff, phoned me one day and said he had been alerted by a resident of Mitchell of the Japanese knotweed problem. So he called me and we went up to take a look, and I was absolutely shocked by what we found. And this picture doesn't even quite capture everything that was there. This was just to get an idea of it. And as you can see, at this point, We're looking in mid-June, about 5 meters in height, and really and truly, you cannot walk through there. It is unbelievably thick. This map gives you an idea of what it is we were looking at. The small orange blobs to the north are just little patches that we found as we went along, and decided that we would include that in the treatment area. The large area at the bottom is a 2.5 acre patch where that initial picture was taken. And that 2.5 acre patch, along with the other patches we've been working on now since the summer of 2019. So we had a really hard time knowing where to even start with the very large patch. So what we did is we rented a skid steer. I'd like to make it clear that using the skid steer with a mulching head was not done to knock back the Japanese knotweed. We knew it would come back. Why we cut it all down was actually more health and safety than anything else. As I said, I endorse the use of herbicides properly for the control of invasive species, but at the same time, I don't want to be spraying 15 feet up in the air where it's going to blow back in my face. That's not ideal and it's not safe. The other problem we had is we didn't really know what was on the ground. And it really comes to light what was in here that we didn't know about. Because I'm going to show you in a moment. The man driving this machine, his name was Mike, and Mike had a bit of a run-in with a raised wellhead that we didn't know was there in the middle of the Japanese knotweed. And needless to say, he came to a very abrupt stop when he hit that raised wellhead, as you can see right now in the middle of the picture. You can also see some metal rods in the background there too. Those were there. We kind of knew some of those were scattered about, but again, we couldn't see them. We didn't know where we had flat terrain. We didn't know where we had uneven terrain. We didn't know where there was down logs or garbage, which of course we found in there as well. So by the time, it took us about the better part of a day to clear the whole area, but it gave us a good starting ground of having knotweed come up at a height that was definitely a lot more manageable. It was a lot safer for us to get into, and where we also knew that we were going to be going. So this is how it looked after it regrew, and that's fine. We expected that. We weren't disappointed by this. We knew that this is, what we would find. And as you can see, very dense. And that's after the first treatment. After the first treatment, we had really good kill. Everything died back. Oh, I've lost the slide. Sorry, there we go. And after the second treatment, again, what we found coming up in that area were a lot of grasses. So the density came down so much that we were able to get a lot of native grasses and a lot of native plants starting to come back up again. Now, of course, we still had Japanese knotweed coming back, but again, every year we've done this, it's come back at reduced density again. And we were up there again this week to do a little bit of spraying. And I, of course, failed to get a picture of what it looks like this year. But those grasses have increased even more. And it might seem like a really simple thing to say, well, it's just grass. But it's not. It's actually a big thing. It's grasses that have come back, native herbaceous plants that have come back instead of Japanese knotweed. So it's a big step. It's a multi-year project. It's always going to be multi-year projects. And even with Japanese knotweed, as we found, we think that there's always going to be touch-ups that need to be done. There's always going to be little plants that seem to sprout out from time to time and will need to be controlled. One of the things that we're thinking of doing in this area in Mitchell is seeding the area with native wildflowers and grasses to see how those outcompete because of the height that they can reach, and see how they outcompete the Japanese knotweed. So another Another species that we find most commonly in the area is buckthorn. TJ Dolan does have quite a bit of buckthorn in it, not to the point where it's one of the primary species, but as you look through through TJ Dolan with informed eyes, it's surprising the number of stems that you can find. So buckthorn or rhamnus is a species of shrub or small to medium sized tree. Most commonly we find European and glossy in Ontario. It's considered to be highly invasive. European buckthorn can grow to be taller than the average human height, and branches end in a woody spine. We have found buckthorn that is almost 10 to 15 centimeters in diameter and 3 meters in height. When it comes to European buckthorn, it has been able to spread in Ontario so well because some of the qualities that these plants have. For example, the plants are efficient growers that do not need much sunlight and are very fertile. Their seeds are hardy, as well as being able to grow and spread easily in a variety of environmental conditions. Animals prefer to leave them alone because they are not appetizing and their fruits can make some animals sick. Now, at the same time, some animals do eat these seeds, and when they're done with those seeds, shall we say, of course, the seed is most ideal as it's been scarified, and at that point, it is ready for germination. So the birds sometimes can be unwelcome spreaders of buckthorn in our environment. Control methods. Many control methods have been used on common and glossy buckthorn. Mechanical, biological, and chemical. Chemical methods, again, herbicides are used when the infestation is great. Resources are limited and other methods have failed. We use herbicides such as glyphosate and triclopyr on the buckthorn, and they both work very well. Mechanical control can be used to kill or remove buckthorn, but mechanical methods are used where the infestation is small or where the presence of other rare or endangered species or habitats are present, and that would prevent the use of pesticide use. The trick with using mechanical methods is that any bit of the sprout that any bit of the root system that is left can easily resprout, and that is really troublesome when using I have a picture of it later on, a weed wrench. Some people can get a little rammy and they get a little too excited about, wrenching this giant buckthorn out, and they break the roots off, and they're really happy about ripping out this giant buckthorn, but unfortunately that root system that they've left in place, it'll resprout, and it has the potential to resprout as more than one buckthorn tree, so not ideal. Another method is girdling, so that involves cutting the phloem, so that would be the inner bark, but you leave the xylem, so the sap would intact. It does prove to be effective, but it doesn't work overly well on really small trees because you can unintentionally cut through the tree in its entirety. And cutting it right off, unfortunately, doesn't work very well. It will resprout even the small ones from the littlest bit of root. So girdling works better on a larger tree where you can very carefully cut back and girdle the tree without actually cutting the tree off. So the goal of buckthorn, of course, is to reduce their numbers in order to provide a regeneration window for native species. And I'm going to show you a couple of pictures here of why that's important. So this is actually TJ Dolan. And this was taken late in the fall. I apologize for the blurriness of it. All of the green is buckthorn. And in the middle of July and August, it's really hard to point out buckthorn to people and give people an idea of how much buckthorn is really in a natural area or a woodlot. It's really in that late bit of fall after all the leaves have dropped off of everything else, and then you look through that natural area or that woodlot, and then you see nothing but green, and then you realize how many stems of buckthorn are really present. Now, all things considered, again, like I said, this isn't considered to be a really bad infestation because I think it's my next slide. Oh, no, this is buckthorn and a pine plantation. Again, there's a lot there. There is some cherry coming up in there too, but there's a lot of buckthorn. But this is a buckthorn thicket. There are no native trees regenerating. There are a few pine, as you can see sort of on the right of the slide. There are a few pine in there, but this is all buckthorn. And they create that solid canopy that prevents any of our native species from regenerating. So that's why it's really important to thin out the herd, as it were, and provide open spaces that we can get the native species to regenerate again. So when we do chemical control, we prefer not to spray an entire tree. And it kind of goes back to what I said with the Japanese knotweed. We don't want to be spraying an entire buckthorn tree that's 3 meters in height. And, you know, when we're spraying way up in the air, we're very targeted with a lot of the herbicide application we do. So the chemical that we use is, as I said, triclopyr. The trade name is Garlon. And it can be applied directly to the main stem. And it's kind of in a wicking manner, so you a little bit around the whole stem, and that will actually kill the buckthorn, and it's highly effective. And in that way, there's not a lot of fallout onto other plants. There's the weed wrench that we're talking about. So as you can see, these 3 gentlemen are all working on getting one buckthorn plant out. And unfortunately, yes, it's a great non-chemical way to do this, but they will have left a great deal of the root system intact underground, and it will resprout from that. The weed wrench is really better for single stem and about half the size of the stem that's in that picture there. It's more ideal for that, much more effective under those conditions. This is actually in one of the ESAs within the City of London. We have elected in TJ Dolan specifically to do the stem treatment that I talked about, and we did a treatment last fall, and we sprayed several hundred stems of buckthorn, and so far what we've seen, it was highly effective. This is a buckthorn plant tree after it's had that girdling spray put on it. It's completely dead. There's no additional fallout. We haven't killed anything else around it. It's just the buckthorn that has died. Phragmites. Thankfully, in TJ Dolan, the little patch of Phragmites we found was just that. It was just a little patch. We treated it, and hopefully at this point, it hasn't come back. But again, I'm going to be out this year to take a look again. So Phragmites is the species that is getting a lot of attention in Ontario, especially around wetlands and in southern Ontario, where it's really kind of choking out a lot of our marshes and our swamps. And the damage it does is really quite extensive to wildlife and native plants. So another place a lot of people see it is along the 400 series highways. It's in the ditches, it's in the medians. The MTO is always trying to control it. They sometimes use chemical, they sometimes do burns. It's a really big problem with along the MTO, or along the 400 series highway, and the MTO is actively going after it now. Unfortunately, it spent many years being allowed to go to seed and spread, because a lot of the seed can be caught up in tires and vehicles and then spread wherever vehicles go. So the problem with invasive non-native Phragmites is that it spreads, as I said, through marshes and wetlands. They replace native plants, and what they do is they deny fish and wildlife nutrients and space. They block access to the water for swimming, fishing, and other recreational endeavors. Aesthetically, they're not a good. They can spoil shoreline views, and when they dry out, again, most people have probably seen this along the 400 series highway, is in the fall, is that there's these dense, really tall patches of, this really dry weed. And obviously, if it were to catch fire, it creates such a black, dark smoke that it creates just a visibility barrier, almost, if you're driving in the middle of a blizzard. So again, that's one of the reasons why the MTO has been going after it as well. So it can it can drive out competing vegetation in two ways. The sheer height and density can deprive other plants of sunlight, and the chemicals that are produced by this plant as it decays, it reduces the germination of competing seeds from native plants. This Phragmites, it comes in so thick that in marshes and wetlands that would have normally been turtle habitat, nesting areas, that the turtles can't get through it. They get caught up in it. We've seen it. They get caught in this Phragmites and are unable to get through where they're going. And that's just an example. It's the same with fish and any other wildlife. So control methods. Management options for the control of frag include, mechanical excavation, which is a little more reasonable than with Japanese knotweed. Phragmites, it does have a deeper root system, but is not as deep as Japanese knotweed. So sometimes along the 400 series highway, sometimes around developments or in other more urban settings, they will dig it out instead of using herbicide. And what they do is they take the spoils off site, and they're usually dumped someplace where they can be controlled or watched. And then if there's any germination from those spoils, then it's usually burned down or maybe even sprayed down with herbicide at that point. It can be flooded out. So if you have, for example, a small pond, and of course, water levels fluctuate every year, so this can be sometimes a bit of a challenge. But if you have a small pond and it starts to grow down and into the water, if you have high enough water levels at certain times of the year, it can be cut below water level and it will drown out. The problem is that with fluctuating water levels, if it's allowed to grow up, then even when the water levels come up, if the plant isn't fully submerged, it won't die due to flooding. So it can be eliminated with prescribed burning, but of course, when you do that, you can burn the stalks that are there, but there's always a seed bank. So this is sometimes a method that requires multiple burns. And again, herbicide application. We use glyphosate primarily on Phragmites. It's times best. We're finding that people have been experimenting, different groups have been experimenting with the timing of it. We used to go with the idea that, it was a late August or early September application, and that was the most ideal time to be using herbicide on Phragmites. But we found that if it's allowed to grow, and that maybe even possibly in early August would be an acceptable time to spray it then. We have found that, and this is for anybody who knows a little bit about herbicides, glyphosate is more commonly known as Roundup, but it goes by many other trade names. But some formulations of glyphosate products have a surfactant in them. And so what that does is it breaks down the leaf cuticle sort of faster and allows for better absorption, penetration of the herbicide. So we don't go with just, regular Roundup, as it were. We get the ones with the surfactant, which are usually the rain fast ones, the ones that can be sprayed and then, it can rain half an hour later and still be effective. So we find that those are most effective. There is another oil surfactant that can be added additionally to that. We are starting to experiment a little bit with that in some of our management areas. So a big point with all of this is that sometimes Phragmites, because of the amount of seed it produces, some of these methods aren't fully effective when used alone. So sometimes it needs to be some removal of seed heads. It needs to be herbicide, maybe burning some of the stalks. Some people have tried the cutting and rolling, following really strict timelines, and that's been really effective for them. Down in Long Point, the areas of Phragmites that they have had to deal with, it's unbelievable. I look at some of the areas that we've had to deal with over the years and feel that they're a bit daunting, but I know some of the areas down at Long Point, the sheer acres of Phragmites that they've had to deal with is really something else. So we tried a couple of years ago, our ESA team, so that's an environmentally significant area team in the city of London. The ESA team had experimented with tarping small stands of Phragmites and leaving them tarped for approximately a year. And the outcome of that was that it had worked well. So I'll get into some pictures. So that's an idea of what Phragmites looks like. That's going to be late in the season. The seed heads have come out, and the seed heads have a very, almost purplish look to them when you get up close. This was a patch of Phragmites in one of the ESAs, and it gets very, very tall. So the ESA team was going in, and they go in with an ATV, and then they have a tank and sprayer. And as you can see, there's a ladder in the background. So they kind of cut a path through the middle of the patch, and they'll have somebody up on the ladder sort of spraying outward from there. It's an interesting sight to see, but because of the sheer height of the Phragmites, it's kind of how you have to get the whole plant. This is along the edge, so a little bit easier to get. Nobody had to be up on a ladder. And that's doing herbicide application. With the Phragmites, you really need to coat it well. I wish I could say that this was a little more direct and just targeting, single plants, but really it's the whole patch. And, there's always the concern, well, what about native plants that might be coming up there? And it's true, it can be a concern, but unfortunate to say that with most patches of Phragmites like this that have been so well established, there are little to no native plants in there. So that's an area that was sprayed. You can see all the dead stalks. As I said, herbicide treatment is very effective. But this area guaranteed will have Phragmites in it again, but it'll be from the seed. So it can be like many of the invasive species that we deal with, it can be a multi-year process. This is a picture of the tarp that they had. So again, Phragmites can definitely grow in wetter areas. So that was a wetter area that they were in. They purchased some large tarps. And of course, everything needs to be weighed down. So they use logs and bricks and broken patio stones, anything that they could find to weigh it down. And then that's a year later after the tarp came off. So it does an effective job, but it takes time. And unfortunately, when it comes to the tarping, we all know how expensive tarps are. If you're talking, a 50 by 50 area, 50 meter by 50 meter area, that's a lot of tarps. And you can really quickly get up into hundreds of dollars in tarps. And as soon as you're talking about an acre of Phragmites, I can't even imagine what the cost of buying enough tarps would be for doing something like that, but it'd be quite significant. I think this is our last, yes, this is our last species, giant hogweed. A lot of people always ask about giant hogweed, and there's obviously concern about it. You always see news stories about it, or on the Weather Network, or at least I do on the Weather Network, about, giant hogweed. It's coming up again. You have to be careful of it. The good news is we don't usually find too much of it in a lot of areas where a lot of people are. Not to say that it's not, but we, well, I'll get into it. There's a spot where we know there's quite a bit of it, but thankfully it's one that's not open to the public. And I know Quinn from the Parks Department in Stratford has dealt with some giant hogweed in TJ Dolan. So rest assured, it's good to know that he's on top of that and taking care of that. And last time I talked to him, I don't think there's too much of it left, so that's a good thing. So giant hogweed typically grows to 2 to 5.5 meters in height. It's found in Ontario, and it's often found in floodplain and riparian areas. The seed is really, when it comes out, it's really well spread by wind and along water courses. So unfortunately, that's why we do find it in riparian and floodplain areas. But a lot of times then we don't always find a lot of people down in those areas either. So a mature plant has huge leaves. They're between 1 and 1.5 meters wide. It has a really thick, stout, bright green stem with extensive dark reddish purple, blotches on it and coloring, and prominent coarse white hairs. They're almost needle-like. If you were to touch them, you could definitely feel like you're almost touching a sewing needle or something like that. The flowers are umbrella shaped. It's called a compound umbel, and they can reach almost a meter in diameter across its flat top, and the flowers are white to greenish white in color. The seeds are produced in August, and a single plant can produce 20,000 seeds on average. And you get some plants that'll produce 10,000 and some that'll produce 50,000. So as I said, the seeds can be dispersed short distances by wind, but they'll definitely travel longer distances in water. And because hogweed, we find it most often in areas like riparian and floodplain. If there are people down there, there's always a lot of animals down there. There's a lot of people down there, people with mountain bikes, people with ATVs, equipment of that nature. And if that seed gets caught up in the mud and the tires and everything else, then unfortunately it gets spread quite easily in that manner. So it's unfortunate. Nobody does it on purpose, but it can really be unfortunate that happens. So pardon me. The sap of the giant hogweed is phototoxic. So contact with the plant sap can prevent the skin from being able to protect itself, which leads to phytophotodermatitis, which is a serious skin inflammation. That is a picture I took off the internet. Unfortunately, there is some really horrible pictures of what this plant can really do. And it is really quite horrible, the burns that can happen from this sap. So it's, I went with a mild picture just so you got the idea, but it's really unfortunate what this stuff can do. So a funny fact about this, in 1971, the album Nursery Crime by the group Genesis was released, and it contained a song called The Return of the Giant Hogweed. And it was a pretty funny song, and it talks about giant hogweed and its attack on the human race. One of my coworkers brought this to my attention several years ago, and I promptly listened to the song, and I have it on my playlist somewhere. And among some of my coworkers that deal with this as well, they found the existence of this song to be quite funny. So some of the lookalikes, and this is where we get a lot of questions and we get a lot of calls and concern for people. We get people phone in and they say, oh my gosh, my ravine area is full of giant hogweed. What am I going to do? Or hey, I was in this area and along the trail and it's full of giant hogweed. I thought you should know. We get a lot of phone calls like that, but fortunately or unfortunately, I guess depending on the way you look at it, a lot of the times we go out and it's not giant hogweed. So one of the things that it can be is cow parsnip. Now I started with this one because it can actually have some of the same effects that giant hogweed does have. The sap is not as phototoxic, but it is phototoxic. The burns are usually a lot milder. If you get your, wherever you're exposed, washed in a reasonable amount of time, it really reduces the chance of getting a bad reaction to it. But again, it looks very similar The leaves look very similar, but the main stem is green and the hairs on it are not as needle-like. They're much softer and there is no purple blotching for cow parsnip. The seed heads, there's not as many umbels either. There's not as many flowers. But otherwise, it's quite understandable why someone can look at this and see giant hogweed because it gets quite tall as well. Another one is Angelica. And again, so some of the commonalities it has is that it has the purple blotching on the stem, but there's no needles, no fine hairs on the stem of Angelica. The leaves do look quite different. They're more of a compound leaf, so they have a lot of small leaflets to them. And the flower head is quite different. So the giant hogweed and cow parsnip have the shape of an umbrella, but Angelica has a very spherical seed head. And funny enough, I've been able over the phone just to ease some people's minds by the simple question of what shape is the seed head? And they always say, well, what do you mean? And I said, well, does it look like an umbrella or does it look like a grapefruit? Does it have the size and shape of a grapefruit? And obviously, you know, if I get the answer that yes, it's like a grapefruit, then I tell them not to worry. And it's Angelica and not giant hogweed. So control methods. If you ever have this on your property, if you ever see it, if you're ever with a group that wants to try and control it, manual control, either by digging or cutting, I really cannot recommend in any way. The chance of getting the sap on you is just, it's far too high, and I really recommend that you stay away from this. The chemical burns, and I can't stress this enough, and I feel like maybe I'm overdoing it, but the chemical burns on this can really be very extensive, and they've led to people that have to get skin grafts and everything like that. It's really not something you want to mess around with, you know. But you know, I put this in here. You know, the young plants can be dug out, but you need to remove the entire root system. The roots are a big taproot and they can be over 1 meter in depth. You know, cutting with a blade or mower, it won't kill the plant back, or it won't kill the plant. It'll just set it back. And you know, as you hit it with a mower or you hit it with like a scythe or whatever you may have, the sap will end up everywhere, and it'll end up on you or anybody else that's sort of in the area. So I really don't recommend it. Chemical control is highly effective. It puts people at the lowest risk, and it's definitely super cheap. It's a quick spray of these plants and it's done. We use a glyphosate product, and it really does the job well. And it's at a low concentration even for killing the plant. It doesn't require a high concentration. So like I said, I know Quinn has been dealing with it a little bit in TJ Dolan, but I thought I would share with you where we had to deal with it in a large area. So there was about 10 acres of giant hogweed found on Upper Thames property several years ago. And we measured out to be about a 10-acre site or so. And this is up in the Glengowan Motherwell area. So what you're looking at there is a field of giant hogweed. And that's just part of it. That's not the whole field. That's just one quick snapshot of it. So that is just thick with giant hogweed. Is there other plants in there? Sure, there's some grasses and whatnot, but at that point, that's primarily giant hogweed. So we were out on site, and you know, everybody's out there, and we use Tyvek suits, and this is a picture of me and many years ago. You know, we use Tyvek suits, gloves, glasses. We're wearing rubber boots. We're fully protected. We have cut giant hogweed before to remove off site because of its proximity to urban areas, proximities to homes and parks. So we have cut it before, but we will always wear a face mask and a shield as well. So this is us spraying it. And after we had sprayed the field, this is what it looked like. I'll go back one. I'll expand on this a little bit. So this is what the field looked like. Unlike, for instance, Japanese knotweed, you know, there's always where you have to go back and deal with the same plants over and over again. This is one spray of this plant and it's done. Now, just like some of the other invasives that we battle with, there is what we call a seed bank. So these plants have been here for years, and it doesn't matter whether we're talking about giant hogweed or buckthorn or Phragmites, they produce seed every year. And in the soil, there's always going to be more seed of the plant that we're trying to control. So most often, it's never a one and done with these invasive species. It requires multiple, you know, attempts, applications, revisiting the area. But our hope always is that when we do this, is that we decrease the density, we decrease the number of stems, and we start to see a regeneration of native species, you know, in the place of where these invasives were, which is really obviously the main goal and why we do this work. It's to promote, you know, native species, reestablishing in an area where they should be, but unfortunately it was taken over by an invasive. So at this point, you know, I'd be more than happy to take some questions.
Awesome. Thank you, Jay. Thank you for that presentation. And also thank you for using what you said is a mild photo of the hogweed.
Yeah.
Because that was enough. I was grateful my video was off to hide my reaction to that.
I have a story I could tell, but I won't tell it about. It's funny. I don't know. Maybe people would want to hear it. It's funny, but.
What is it, gross?
No, it's just very funny.
Okay.
Should I?
Sure.
Okay. Yeah. When I was with the Grand River Conservation Authority, I had been called out by the weed inspector for Waterloo County, I believe it was. And he had been on site before I was supposed to meet him, and it was about giant hogweed. And when we got on site, there was a small parkette of an authority-owned property. And so I met him there, and I noticed when I got there that there was a police car and then a couple of other cars that the police car had kind of just sort of blocked in a little bit. And when I got out to talk with the weed inspector, you know, we introduced ourselves, and it was the first time we had met, and he let out a bit of a chuckle, and I said, well, what's so funny? And he said, well, those two cars, a bunch of teenagers, young adults who had been kind of drinking in the parking lot and goofing around a little bit. And I said, well, what were they doing? And he said, well, they were pulling out the giant hogweed and hitting each other with them. And I said, oh my God. He said, yeah. So I called the police officer over, and I mean, it's funny, not funny, but I explained to him what the plant was and what they had been doing. And his back was turned to them, and he let out quite the chuckle. And I said, it might be best to get these guys home and showered to prevent some burns from happening. He says, I will be quick with them, and I'll explain to them the folly of their mistake. So that was a little incident that had happened with giant hogweed and some not so wise young men.
Yeah, that's not fun.
I don't know what that ended up turning into, but I feel very bad for those guys.
I feel like they would have learned a lesson.
Yeah, I think so.
It kind of speaks to you've received a lot of questions, okay, both on Zoom and through Facebook. And kind of the theme of several of them is identifying these. So people asking, you know, what if I have something in my yard that I think might be an invasive species? What resources are there? I wondered if Upper Thames has any kind of photo albums to direct people to kind of help people identifying those, or if the iNaturalist app that we have people using, if that identifies invasive species.
There's quite a bit out there. A lot of different CAs will have fact sheets on invasive species. We do. Obviously not everything. There is the Ontario Invasive Plant Council, and their website is very good. They have a lot of information about IDing native species as well, or invasive species, not native, invasive species. Now, keep in mind, there is also a difference between invasive and toxic noxious weeds. So things like poison ivy and the giant hogweed can be invasive, but the plant's poisonous to touch is a bit different as well. But
Right.
quite often, I think those websites will also have maybe little fact sheets on things like poison ivy as well. So just
Okay. And then that iNaturalist app, it will, so the app is you hold your phone up to the species and it will tell you what it is, or you can submit a photo to the website, right?
Yep, and there's a couple of different apps that are out there as well, and some of the apps help you. If the app can't actually identify it from the picture, what it can do is sometimes it kind of runs you down through like a bit of a yes no flow chart of is the leaf this color, is it this color, is it is it compound or is it single, is it this and that, and then sometimes that helps the app narrow down what it is, and then it shows you like 2 or 3 more pictures, and then from there you kind of be like, no, that's it there, that's the one. So some of those
Okay.
apps have that feature to them.
Okay. And another kind of theme to the questions is, if people have identified an invasive species either on public lands or private property, who do they call? Who do they call?
Yeah, so if the invasive species is found on public property, I won't go so far to say that those responsible for managing that property know about it. Chances are they do, but it wouldn't hurt reporting it, especially if it's something like giant hogweed, which is also noxious. Something like buckthorn. If you're in, I wish I could give it an example right now, but if you were, in a woodlot, like that's part of a park or something like that, and has buckthorn in it, chances are those managing that area, they know it's there. But sometimes management programs for some invasive species like buckthorn, they just don't do it, especially if it's like at a lower, density. But if you find something that's a noxious weed, poison ivy, giant hogweed, it wouldn't hurt to report the cow parsnip. Those are always good ones to report to the, the managing bodies of those areas, because they might not know that it's there, because that stuff can just appear. It wasn't there last year, but then it's there this year. And that's more of a public safety thing. So that's worth reporting. As far as on your own land, on private land, there's no need to report it anywhere, but removing it all depends on the person and kind of the situation, just whatever the situation is. If you have something like poison ivy or giant hogweed on your property, you're probably going to want to remove it, but I would highly recommend that you do it very, very carefully. You could either call somebody in, or for plants like that, you can actually buy from, it's not TSC anymore, a PV Mart.
Oh,
Sorry, I was trying to remember the name of it for a second. From PV Mart, you can actually buy a glyphosate product. You have to sign a waiver. You have to, I think you have to sign an agreement that says, yes, I'm using this on a noxious weed or something like that. So you can get a Roundup, a glyphosate product that would kill giant hogweed or poison ivy. Again, I recommend being very careful. I know I've said it 100 times, but I'm going to recommend it again. Don't cut it. Don't cut it. Spray it with something. Don't burn it. Whatever you do, don't burn either one of those, poison ivy or giant hogweed. Don't burn them. The smoke is it's very, very bad, and it could hospitalize you if you breathe it in. So don't burn it either. Whatever you do. If you have, sorry, I'm trying to answer the question. So if you have something like buckthorn, something that's more of a management for, ecosystem health, Japanese knotweed, the buckthorn, the frag. We've given you some tips. We don't mind calls at the authority from landowners who have questions about this. I'm more than happy to talk to people. Additionally, hiring people to do this for you, depending on your problem, might be something you have to do as well, but every situation is different. So I can't answer that question too much more other than, private land, it's yours to deal with. But public land, if it's a noxious weed, reporting it's a good idea. But things like Japanese knotweed, buckthorn, the managing body of the property probably knows that it's there.
Okay. Someone asked if the tarping method that you showed pictures of works for Japanese knotweed.
It can. And funny enough, we're actually going to try a little patch in Mitchell this year. So the trick with Japanese knotweed is because it's bamboo, like sometimes when it's cut, because you have to cut it really short, it can create almost like a spearhead, because it never really cuts really properly. And what can it do? It can poke a hole in the tarp, and as soon as there's a hole in the tarp, then that plant takes full opportunity of that hole and will go through it. We were thinking of actually also trying out a really thick mat of bed straw, to see if blocking out the sunlight would stop regeneration of Japanese knotweed as well. But I mean, a very, very thick, I'm trying to maybe, 4 or 5 inches thick layer of bed straw to block out sunlight and suppress Japanese knotweed that way.
So with some of these treatment ideas, you're in a lot of cases testing out theories. Like you mentioned, planting wildflowers to combat the Japanese knotweed. Like I wondered if there is anywhere else that is testing this, or is this kind of a new theory or hypothesis that Upper Thames is?
I'm sure, you know what, it's probably an idea that's popped into the mind of people that do this. I don't feel like this is an original idea on our part,
Right.
but it's definitely something we haven't tried before. A big thing with a lot of this invasive species management is what they call IPM, integrated pest management. And if we keep spraying the same herbicides over and over again on the same spot, on the same plants, at some point the plant's just going to shrug it off and say, I don't care that you're spraying me with Garland anymore. I'm going to keep growing. So we have to take a proactive approach to, we can't wait until the plant starts to shrug off the chemicals we're using. We need to mix things up. And so using, native plants to help suppress it, is one of the ideas that we had. The bed straw is an idea we've had. And yeah, we're trying it out just to see how it works. I'm afraid I can't say whether it will or won't work, but it's, it has to be part of that program.
On that note, one of the questions is regarding, do the herbicides also kill the native plants?
Yes. And let me be clear. So, and I'm just going to go quickly by the 4 species I talked about, and I'm not going to get too in depth, but Phragmites, when you spray Phragmites, an established stand of Phragmites with herbicide, there's not a whole lot of native plant material there. There's nothing coming up. That's the whole point. The frag chokes it out. Same with the Japanese knotweed. There's not a lot of native plant material there. With the buckthorn, it's a very targeted approach. We don't do a fuller spray. So like contacting the leaves of buckthorn, we do it where it's just a stem application. So, if the stem of the tree were, let's say, about 5 inches in diameter, we'd probably spray it 3 or 4 spots around the stem. And what we use, it creates like a bit of a wicking because it's mixed with an oil, is it wicks around the stem, and then it's absorbed that way. So we don't really kill any other neighboring plant material, native plant material. It's really just targeted on the buckthorn. So when we do, however, and I will admit, and like I said, this is about transparency and honesty, is, for instance, in Mitchell, where we have that Japanese knotweed coming up, we are having success, and we are having where those grasses are coming in, but there's still plants coming up in the middle of it. So am I, blasting my spray all over that area? No, I'm trying to go plant by plant, but there is still going to be a little bit of vegetation beside it that gets affected. Now, thankfully, some of those plants just aren't affected by that herbicide either. Some of the herbicides we use are very specific. Some are contact herbicide that kills everything depending on its concentration, like a glyphosate product. But the Garlon, which is what we use on the buckthorn and on the Japanese knotweed, is actually meant for more woody stems. So at high concentrations, it can kill grass, but at some of the lower concentrations that we're using, it doesn't. Now, not to say that, you know, we want to keep using it and spraying, and I just spray the grass anyways, thinking that it wouldn't kill it, you know, because there could be a plant in there that could be affected by it. So we try to avoid large patches of native material that are coming up, and we really just try to get the plants that we can.
Well, and tackling the invasive species gives the native plants a better chance at surviving, right?
In the end, yeah. And it is tough that sometimes in these situations, you can see a little bit of native regeneration coming up, but you know you have to get all the area around it.
Mm-hmm.
And you just have to, you know, the greater good for that the environment in that area is that you may have to kill some of that new growth of a native plant, knowing that it'll come back again. Like, it'll seed in from somewhere else. It seeded in the first time, it'll seed in again. You know, we might kill a little cherry tree or something that's coming up, but you know what? There's a mother cherry tree over there. It's going to put out more seed. You know, once we're done fighting this for a couple of years, you know, that cherry tree, it'll be great. It can put out all the seed at once, and we won't be spraying anymore. So
Right. Yeah, the greater vision.
Yep.
We had a question specifically to buckthorn and garland. So can you pull the buckthorn out the year after application of garland and not have the roots regrow?
That's a good question. I don't think we've ever done that.
I don't know the answer either, Jay.
Yeah. Well, one of the issues with that, though, is, as I mentioned before, the seed bank. So if you were to pull it out, what can happen is you create that big disturbance. So you know, what might have been grasses or maybe some other low cover of herbaceous material is that when you, and it's covering the soil, so there's no bare soil, but there's seed in there. So when you pull that stem of buckthorn out, what happens is obviously it creates a big opening, and then what happens is that seed is exposed. So seed that is being suppressed might not be suppressed anymore. So might you have stuff come up from the roots? I don't know. I don't think so. But you'll probably have stuff come up from the seed. Your best bet in that case is to actually just cut it as low as you can with a chainsaw or pruning saw, or a pair of loppers, depending on their size. Just cut it as low as you can. Maybe stay away from pulling it in those situations.
Okay. This question is actually from Craig.
Oh.
In Jay's opinion, which species is the highest threat to our natural areas?
Just for the record, Craig Merkley is one of our co-workers, and I think he's trying to stop me right now. I don't know. And you know what? Every situation is different. Every woodlot, every ecosystem, every natural area is different. You know, a wetland, you know, the greatest threat is Phragmites. A small woodlot that's, you know, maybe only 5 or 6 acres, and it has a lot of buckthorn around its perimeter. That's the greatest threat in that one. Yeah, it's really tough to say. I will say this: for its persistence, its sheer density, the Japanese knotweed is definitely one of the most challenging ones that we have to deal with. Thankfully, the one thing, and I should have actually mentioned this, the amount of viable seed that Japanese knotweed produces is actually very low. Most of the seed it produces is actually non-viable. It actually spreads through roots, and I had mentioned earlier that, you know, when a giant mass is in a riparian area and then it erodes off and then travels downstream, well, obviously it leaves some roots behind, so it continues growing, but that mass that goes downstream can actually re-root. And actually that's a lot of how, you know, it moves around, is it's pieces of root, pieces of the plant that go downstream. Yeah, some of the flowers are viable, but a lot of it's through actual plant matter moving from spot to spot. So, okay. And for that reason too, I'm going to say, in my opinion, Japanese knotweed is the one that scares me the most right now.
Okay.
Yeah.
that kind of leads in well to Anne's question, which was how do the patches get there? So the patches of the Japanese knotweed, for example, and you were talking about that they can spread through plant matter or by animals on people.
Yeah.
How
So
do-
the Japanese knotweed in Mitchell, we don't know. As a bit of a curiosity, admittedly, and when we were curious about this, we actually did some driving around just to see where it may have come from upstream, but we didn't see any. And the funny thing is, Mitchell's fairly high in our headwaters. So there might be a patch somewhere that we just couldn't find, private land and everything like that. We don't have the right to go on there. So there could be a giant patch on private land that we just couldn't find. And as much as I would have loved to have gone upstream on a kayak or a canoe, we weren't doing that at the time. So could it have come from upstream? Yes. And the really big thing is that it could have just been planted by somebody.
Mm-hmm.
And that happens quite often with a lot of these invasive plants, is that somebody bought it, they thought it was really nice, and they thought, oh, I wouldn't mind seeing that, and they planted it there. Another thing is, and I think it was, Terry that mentioned it, about people dumping, yes, it was Terry that mentioned it, people dumping yard waste.
Yeah.
Someone may have had Japanese knotweed in their yard, realized what it was and thought, oh, I don't want this. It's an invasive plant. And they may have cut it down. And they may have thought, well, where will I put it? And they dumped it in this area. And unfortunately, like I said, it can reroot from cuttings and pieces of root and everything like that. So it may have happened that way, unfortunately. Yeah, it's hard to know.
And are things like Japanese knotweed still sold in nurseries? That was one of the questions, is Phragmites look like ornamental grasses often seen in yards?
Yeah, and it's funny because there is native grasses in the same family as the Phragmites that is actually native and we have growing here in Ontario. It's very different. But again, it's a bit of the trained eye. I hope I haven't jaded anybody's trips to the outdoors coming up to this, because I do get one comment is, like, now that I know what it looks like, I see it everywhere. So when you see Phragmites next to our native grasses, to me, it's night and day, and to a trained eye, it can be night and day, or not even a trained, just an experienced eye. It can be night and day between density, height, color, even feel, just even the texture of the leaves. But yes, if you saw a big patch of 7-foot grass on your neighbor's lawn, you might think, well, wow, that looks just like the Phragmites. It has a lot of similarities to what Jay described. Well, true. And yes, you can buy it in garden centers, but usually garden centers are selling the native one. Over the years, especially because invasive species have become much more of a topic, much more of a awareness. The awareness of it has risen, that municipalities, conservation authorities, the MNRF, the Ontario Invasive Plant Council have put out a lot of information packets to a lot of these nurseries, and they've said, hey, you guys sell this or you've sold this, please stop. And a lot of people that run these nurseries, they can appreciate this. They know that it's invasive, and they don't like those words either. Just because something isn't native doesn't mean it's not beautiful, but at the same time, there's a lot of non-native stuff out there that isn't invasive. And we plant a lot of that in our lawns and our gardens, and that's fine. But a lot of these plant centers, when they have found out that these species and other ones like them are highly invasive, they've stopped selling them. So could you still find some of these plants at some plant centers? Maybe for someone who's maybe if you go to one that's really out of the loop, but I think for the most part, a lot of plant centers won't sell most of these plants anymore. And if you do, I would encourage letting the people there know what it is that they're still selling. Don't make an issue of it, but you know, a little bit of education never hurt anybody.
Well said. Your cat has also made a little debut into this webinar, so I've been enjoying. They've moved on since, but they
okay.
have been in the webinar.
What were they
It's
doing?
good.
Were they wrestling?
No, just one. It's good. It was a good addition. So one question is, are there additional or different options to treat Phragmites in the United States? Do they have different methods?
So I don't know a lot about what they've been doing down there. I have to admit, I know they have big frag problems in Michigan, really significant ones. I feel for the most part, they're a little heavy on the pesticides. But I would imagine just like the MTO, they are using excavation along the 400 series highway. So I would hope they're doing that in Michigan as well, where they're removing giant patches of Phragmites with excavation. They're carting the material off-site and storing it and keeping an eye on it, sort of thing. So it's not that chemicals aren't being used in that process, because sometimes what they'll do is they'll spray down those mounds. But also sometimes I know they use burning for that too. Once it's off-site, and that way it doesn't become that visibility issue along the 400 series highways.
Okay. There seems to be a lot of garlic mustard in the TJ Dolan area.
Yes.
Is that something we should also be attempting to control?
There was one other plant that we went after in TJ Dolan, periwinkle. And I am going to talk about the garlic mustard, but so periwinkle is a ground cover. It's pretty thick. People have it in their lawns and gardens. It's non-native. It's aggressive. So we spent a little bit of time controlling some of the periwinkle, but again, we were trying to be really careful about that. We had some really concentrated patches, so that's why we did that. So with garlic mustard, yeah, garlic mustard isn't the greatest, but all things considered, it's definitely not the worst we've been finding. But unfortunately with garlic mustard, there's a couple things. If you were to try to control it, you'd have to go in before it goes to seed and basically try and cut it down. If you go in after it's set seed, when you hit it with a weed trimmer, for example, unfortunately, all you do is boom, like the seed just goes everywhere. And then from a chemical controls perspective, as I said, I promote the use of this, but with the caveat of this is about environmental benefit. This isn't about aesthetics. This is about environmental benefit. So if we were to go in there and try and control garlic mustard using chemical, the amount of damage that we would do to native plant material is not something I am comfortable with, and I would not promote. So yeah.
Okay, that's good to know. This is a specific question, and I think it'll be among our last one. Should a homeowner with a significant Japanese knotweed infestation use Garlon or glyphosate?
Glyphosate?
Glyphosate, thank you.
Typical homeowner can't probably buy either one of them.
Yeah.
You need specialized licenses, both chemicals. The Garlon is very heavily regulated right now. Glyphosate, like I said, you can buy it for doing noxious weeds, but yeah, doing Japanese knotweed, you're probably not able to buy enough of it at the right concentration. You could try repeatedly cutting it and suppressing it. I guess without knowing how big your patch is, it's a little hard to give you the best advice. Cutting it, pulling it, continually doing so. I have spoken to a few homeowners who have a small patch of it on, in their property, and they've done that, and it will work. You're still going to get stragglers every year, but hopefully you can take a patch that's dense, and there's nothing else there, and then hopefully over the course of several years it can be reduced to just the odd stem that's coming up here and there. But yeah, you could try suppressing it with, a tarp, as I said, we're going to try doing. You could try buying, no, I'm not even going to say that. Nope. Yeah, chances are you can't buy any of the products that you need to do it as a homeowner, which is tough, I admit. But there are, lawn care companies that might be able to help you with that. They might be able to help with using organic chemicals, the iron ferrite or the acetic acid. I don't know how well those work, but you would need multiple applications of those. That I know for sure.
And I guess the benefit with that is that they have more knowledge than the average homeowner to know the repercussions of what you're using and
Yeah.
safe application of that.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so Councillor Henderson is on the webinar and she said it's better to get help rather than trying to use those chemicals for sure, which I would reiterate. I did want to bring people's attention. So as I said, we have a lot of questions about identifying the actual species and what to do with them. And I just did a quick Google search. All I typed in was UTRCA and invasive species. And there are some PDFs, as you mentioned, about the specific types that we've been talking about tonight. So there's more information there on the website. And then as Jay has graciously offered, you could call the Upper Thames if you have any further questions.
Yeah, for sure.
So we've put that out there, Jay. Be prepared for the phone to ring off the hook.
Okay. Fair enough.
And with that, I think that I covered all of the questions from tonight. I would like to thank you for your time. I know that I invited you to a wine and cheese night.
Yeah.
And quickly took on a bit of a different vibe. So thank you very much. It was really informative. And I think based on all the questions that we got in, people found it really, really useful.
Good.
I want to remind people that a recording of tonight's event will be available on the city's website. And again, if you require that in any different format, just contact the city clerk's office and they can make that available to you. This was a webinar in partnership with the City of Stratford's Energy and Environment Committee, as well as Climate Momentum and Stratford Field Naturalists. And we are going to take a short hiatus through the summer to hopefully enjoy lovely weather outdoors. And we'll be coming back in the fall with another webinar, which we hope to have. The City of Stratford has a new GHG coordinator who has been hired. So we hope to have her speak about the City of Stratford's climate action plan. So stay tuned for that. What you can do is go to climatemomentum.ca for that event information. And I encourage you to sign up for their e-newsletter because they'll just be sending updates about things like this and other ways to get involved in environmental issues in the city and surrounding area. So again, I just want to thank you, Jay, for your time. I really appreciate it. And I know that everyone that tuned in tonight and in the future did as well. I thank Terry for joining us from Stratford Field Naturalists and Bill from Climate Momentum for sharing that land acknowledgement. And I also want to thank Tatiana and Mike Bites from the City of Stratford for all of their help in getting this set up and publicizing tonight's event. Jay, do you want to say any last words before we sign off? Your cat is still with you, which I love. Any final words, Jay?
I don't. That's Sycamore. He's trouble. No, I don't have any final words. Thank you for having me. I probably could have spent a lot longer talking about invasive species. I tried to condense. There's a lot of information out there. Emily's right. Going online and doing research yourself. This was more of an awareness thing. I by no means am the overall expert on any of these things. I encourage you to make use of any resources that you can to find out more. If you have a particular species that you're concerned about, the internet's a great spot, and you can give me a call and I will do my best to get back to you as soon as possible. Please keep in mind, I'm really busy with a lot of stuff in the field these days, but I will do my best to get back to anybody who gives me a call.
Fair enough.
Okay.
And Jay, one last thing. So the one app that we mentioned was iNaturalist. So the letter I, Naturalist. And did you have any other apps?
I
Like
use
specific
one
apps
called,
you like?
yeah, I use one called PlantNet.
Okay, PlantNet.
And that one has, like I said, it has a bit of a flow chart of if it can't be readily identified, it, you know, it says, you know, like,
Right.
is there 4 lobes or 5 lobes? Is there, you know, 2 leaflets or 3 leaflets? It helps you kind of figure it out.
Okay. And that'll avoid people having a similar experience to those teenagers that you that you shared this story.
Yeah, I wondered about that story, but no, I think it's funny. I really hope those guys didn't end up with any bad burns. But
If they're listening, let us know how you made out.
yeah, I hate to say it, but the worst part of the funniest part of the whole story was the look on the police officer's face when I told him what it was. And I think he took pity on them at that point. So
Okay, that's nice. I don't want to, I want to avoid that situation. So I will take you up on your advice with the apps. All right, thanks again. And thank you to everyone that joined. What night is this? Tuesday? Happy Tuesday evening. Bye, everyone. Thank you very much.